Have you ever wrestled with God? I don't mean like physically, right? But like wrestled emotionally with what he's called you to do in your life. We're going to see two examples of that today, especially Jacob, who literally wrestled with God. You'll find out more right now at 1. What is up, guys? We are back at it again here for another Wednesday edition of 1. We have been in the middle of a series called In the Beginning, which kind of sounds confusing, but we are going to be walking through a chapter in Genesis that is kind of random and kind of thrown in there, but is huge and has tons of implications to how we should be living our lives and how all of this pointed to Jesus. Now, we are in the middle of the story of Jacob and Esau, and we saw last time that we were here, before we had the challenge and the challenge recap, 2 weeks ago when we got together, we talked about how Jacob took his brother Esau's blessing, how he fooled his dad, Isaac, Abraham's son, how he fooled him and he took his brother's blessing. We also see how Esau, the older brother, sold his birthright for some stew, some food, right? Some carne guisada, and he gave it up for that because he was so hungry. And we talked about how that momentary pleasure for him was more important than that blessing and that inheritance that was coming to him. All of this was foretold for by God, right? And we saw how all that pointed to Jesus at the end of the last episode, at the end of our last one. Now, as we fast forward, we're going to kind of skip ahead. You see Jacob here comes face to face with his own sin. God, in order to get him to realize and repent, right, from what he has done, he got confronted by his uncle Laban. And in order to marry one of his daughters, he was deceived kind of again and again and again. And so by the end of it, Jacob had all of these wives. He ends up having 12 kids, okay? The 12 tribes of Israel, which would eventually be who they become. But in all of this, he has to return home. And the reason he left was because Esau, his older brother, well, he wanted to kill him. Thrown into all of that, we see this chapter. You see Jacob on his way home comes across some angels, and the angels say, "Oh, by the way, we just told Esau you're coming." And he's headed here with like 400 dudes. Now, either he's got a lot of friends or Esau was coming with an army to pay Jacob back for what he did. And that is where we pick up, because in the middle of all of this, Jacob sends his family, his wives and his kids and everyone across the river of Jabbok. And on the other side, he's alone by a fire, right? I'm just kind of picturing this, right? Because it's at night, so he has to have that fire to see. And we see one of the strangest chapters in the book of Genesis right here. Let's take a look at what happens in Genesis chapter 32, verse 22 through 32. The same night he arose, we're talking about Jacob, and he took his 2 wives and his 2 female servants and his 11 children, and they crossed the ford of the Jabbok. So he sends his family across the river because he already knows that his brother Esau is coming. He already knows that he's coming with 400 other men. Doesn't really know what the intentions and the purpose are there, but he knows that the angels told Esau that he was coming. So he sends his family, he sent them across the stream, and with everything that he had. He was traveling with all of the stuff that he got from his uncle Laban. Now, that again, another chapter to go through a different time. And Jacob was left all alone. Now, I don't know about you guys, but for me, when I'm all alone and I'm in prayer and I'm going through everything in my head, that is when I have the best chance really to wrestle with what God has going on in my life. Sometimes I like to talk stuff out with my wife, which is always awesome, but in that alone time with God, where I really get to grapple with, okay, God, is this really what you want me to do? Is this really what your word is telling me I need to do, or how I need to live, or a sin that I really need to cut out of my life? That's where I really get to process and digest and struggle. In this alone time, Jacob gets ambushed. A man literally comes out and he saw, right, and wrestles with him until the breaking of the day. So this wrestling match, this fight, literally took all night. And Jacob is not going to give up. Jacob was a bit stubborn. We've kind of seen that throughout his story. And when this man saw that he was not going to prevail, because Jacob has no idea who he even is. And Jacob wasn't going to give up. He's fighting for his life. He has no idea what's going on and who this man is. When this man sees that Jacob isn't going to give up, he touches his hip socket. And Jacob's hip was put out of his joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day has broken." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." In this wrestling, he even had a broken hip. This person said, "Look, we've been doing this all night. Let me go. I'm done." And Jacob said no, because he knew who he was wrestling with. He knew who this struggle was with. I mean, imagine someone touching your hip and it becomes dislocated. That you could be like the best UFC fighter ever, and that's not going to happen. And so after that, he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Where was I? Then he said, "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed." In this moment, God tells Jacob who Jacob has been wrestling with. Jacob already kind of figured it out. That's why he was asking for that blessing. But God says, you've wrestled with God and you have prevailed. You haven't given up. And when we think about us in our wrestling with God, in our wrestling with his commandments, in our wrestling with what he wants us to do, there's times where God's will for our life is going to cause us to walk through some pretty painful stuff. There's times where separating from sinful people or sinful behaviors or really trying to be conformed to the image of God, we struggle. And the people who get the blessing are the people who persevere, are the people who don't give up. We may not always feel like we're winning. We may not always feel like we're worth it. We may not always feel like we are going to come out on top. But what God is saying here, right, is because of his perseverance, because he refused to give up, Jacob was blessed and his name was changed. His name was changed to Israel, which is a really interesting thing because his sons eventually become the 12 tribes of Israel, the Israelite nation, God's own people. The people that were promised to Abraham that would outnumber the stars. We keep going back to that, but that's Jacob's grandpa we're talking about. That blessing is being passed down to him. We saw that a little bit when we had his dad pass on the blessing that was due to Esau. We even saw that same language. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse those who curse you. And here we see that very same thing. "Please tell me your name." And the man said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel. And he said, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered." The sun rose up, and as he passed, he was limping because of his hip. He wrestled with God, just like we wrestle with God. And just like us, again, his pain in that moment was his hip being dislocated. For us, it may be that struggle of really trusting God. It may be that struggle of really letting go of something that's hurting us and holding on to us. And so Jacob crosses the river. He meets his brother Esau, and he is forgiven. His brother Esau forgives him for what he did, and they're able to be reunited, these twin brothers, years and years later. Now, all of this story is great, and it's really interesting that that is kind of sandwiched in there. But because of that wrestling with God, Jacob was no longer fearful of his brother. He saw that he could wrestle with God, he could struggle with his sin, and then turn around and face man, because really, who's the judge at the end of the day? It's God, it's not man. Excuse me. And so he goes and he sees Esau, they're reunited, and the story continues. And we're going to look at Jacob's sons and what they did to his favorite son next week. But in our series, we've looked at kind of who we are, we've looked at who God is, and we look at how all of this points to Jesus. That's really the point of the series, right? We're looking at the first book of the Bible and seeing how Jesus is almost in every single page. And we see that Jesus lived this perfect life. And yet there were even times he wrestled with what God's will for his life was. One of the times that just immediately stands out to me is at the back end of Matthew, in Matthew chapter 26, verses 36 through 46. Jesus already knows that Judas has sold him out. Jesus already knows what is coming. He already knows that his Father has worked out this plan to redeem and restore a group of people back to him. And Jesus knows that God's will for his life is going to end at the cross. And he himself even wrestled with what God's will for his life was. It was in the Garden of Gethsemane. His disciples were exhausted and tired. It was the middle of the night. And Jesus says, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." And taking with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, which are James and John, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Jesus was troubled. He was sorrowful. He was worried. He was anxious about what was to come. And then he said, "My soul is sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me." He's telling this to his disciples. Pray with me. Stay up with me. Don't leave me alone. And going a little farther in, he fell on his face and he prayed and he said, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me." Now, this cup that was about to be delivered to Jesus was the cup of wrath that God has to pour out onto his son so that we as sinners can be redeemed and restored back to him. The crazy thing in all of this, right, is that in Jesus's wrestling with God's will and God's plan, Jesus does something that should blow our mind, right? Jesus knew what was coming to him. Jacob didn't. Jesus knew the pain that he was about to go through. Jacob didn't, right? And even through Jacob's broken hip or dislocated hip, he persevered in wrestling with God. Jesus wrestled with God in a different way. He submitted to God. Now, in wrestling terms, that's probably not the best way to explain it, right? But we're not talking about wrestling. We're talking about submitting to God's will for his life, despite the pain that was about to come to him. And he asks the Father, "Nonetheless, not my will, but yours be done." And he came to his disciples and he found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, "You couldn't watch and stay up with me for 1 hour while I was praying? Watch and pray so that you don't enter into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." And again, for a second time, he went away and he prayed. And again, he said, "My Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done." Jesus struggled here. He wasn't worried about being hurt. He wasn't worried about dying, though. The part that worried him was the separation from God that he was about to experience on the cross. And so we see here as we wrap up these verses in Matthew, and again, for a second time, he went away and he prayed, and he came back and he found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. And so leaving them away, again, he prays for a third time. All of this he did alone. He went to wrestle with God's will alone. Then he came to the disciples and he said to them, "Sleep and take your rest later on. The hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is about to be betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go, because my betrayer is at hand." As Jacob finished wrestling, he saw Esau coming, and Esau was able to forgive him, this man that wanted him dead. And we see God's grace all over that. Because Jesus was betrayed, and because Jesus went through this pain for us, we can be forgiven. Not by our brothers, though. We are forgiven by God, who is ultimately the judge of everything. So I ask you the question, when you wrestle with God, when you struggle with what God's will is for your life, are you persistent, or do you give up because you feel like you're not worth it? Do you keep on trying to conform yourself to the image of Christ? Or do you say, you know what, screw it, I'm done, I'm a sinner, and I cannot do this anymore? Because the blessing doesn't come to those who gives up. The blessing comes to those who persevere and make it to the end. I think of what Paul says, where he says, you have run the race. You have made it to the end. You have persevered. You have fought and scratched and clawed and done everything that you can to be obedient and to live out God's will for your life. And ultimately, when we look at what it is to wrestle with God, we see that the Israelite people, the people named after and who came after Jacob, right after he becomes Israel, those people are the very same people who wrestle with God and his will on a daily basis. There were so many times where they let God down. We see that right after God delivers them in Egypt. Moses goes up to Mount Sinai and they turn away and they start worshiping a false idol, and God has to bring them through judgment, right? He has to get them back, and they wrestle with that. They don't like it. We see that in our lives with our sin. It's just crazy how this book, the Bible, that was written over thousands of years ago, is still so relevant and true to our lives today. I am super pumped to walk through our last story with you guys next week about Joseph, one of Jacob or Israel's sons, and to really show you how all of his life leads to or foreshadows Jesus is something I can't wait to do. But being that we're at the end of this series, being that we've already made it through the book of Genesis, 50 chapters, which is crazy, we are transitioning to a series that we are going to call Questions, where we look at some of the biggest questions that we as believers face on a day in and day out basis. Questions that may have even given you a pause to actually stop and wonder like, yo, I don't have an answer for that. Questions like, doesn't every religion lead back to God? Is Jesus really God? I mean, it never says that in the Bible. Questions like, can you even trust that Bible that was written thousands of years ago? Questions that you guys have probably heard time and time again. We are going to give you a biblical answer to those in our very next series, which is just a few weeks away. And I can't wait to get there. But until then, I love you guys. I will see you all very soon. Laters. Ha.